All right, so get ready. Because today we're diving into something, well, let's just say it's not your everyday topic. We're talking about eating dirt. Yeah, you heard that right. Dirt. I know. It sounds kind of out there. But trust me on this, it gets really interesting. We're going to be digging into this podcast I listened to about Pica, which is, well, it's a disorder where people crave stuff that isn't actually food. And get this, there's a whole TikTok trend connected to it. Wild. Right. So before we really get into it, I'm curious. Have you guys seen this dirt-eating thing popping up on your feeds at all? I mean, it's everywhere. And honestly, the reasons behind it are way more interesting than you might think. So first things first, we've got to figure out what we're actually dealing with here. So this podcast, right, they said Pica is more than just like craving ice. We're talking about people wanting to eat dirt, chalk, even soap.
And get this, they even mentioned that it can be connected to, like autism or even pregnancy. But here's the thing that really blew my mind. Sometimes, the podcast said, these cravings, especially for dirt, it could be our body's weird way of trying to tell us something's up.
Yeah, that's actually true. What's so fascinating about pica is that sometimes it can be a sign of a nutritional deficiency. Like if someone's really low on iron or zinc, their body might actually crave dirt as a way to get those nutrients, Of course, the podcast also mentioned the cultural and psychological sides of it too, which, we can definitely get into. That's a really important point you brought up. It's not always as simple as just a deficiency. The podcast gave some really interesting examples of cultures where eating dirt, they call it geophagy, is totally normal. It kind of makes you think about how much our idea of food is shaped by where we grew up and what we're used to.
Right. It totally changes your perspective. But what about that psychological side they were talking about? That seems like a whole other thing.
Oh, absolutely. That really struck a chord with me, actually. The podcast was saying how pica can sometimes be connected to, like, OCD or anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that eating these non-food items, it could be a way for some people to feel more in control or even get some relief from their anxiety,
Wow, that definitely makes you think about this whole TikTok trend differently. It's not just about getting views. There might be some deeper stuff going on for some people, though the podcast definitely raised some red flags about the dangers of this whole trend, especially for your health. They got into some pretty serious stuff about the risks of eating things you find in the soil.
Yeah, and it's worrying because you don't always see that side of it online, the risks. The podcast even mentioned heavy metals like lead, which can be really bad, especially for kids. They said lead poisoning can actually mess with brain development, which is terrifying.
Oh, and don't even get me started on the parasite thing. The podcast had some pretty wild descriptions of what can happen if you eat certain types of dirt. They talked about hookworms, which can apparently really mess up your stomach.
Yeah.
Not a good time.
No, not at all. And it's, like you said, it's a perfect example of how something that seems harmless online can actually be really dangerous in real life. It reminds us that we can't always separate the online world from the real world, especially when it comes to our health.
So what do we do? Like,
Yeah.
Seriously, how do we deal with this? It feels like every time you turn around, there's another dangerous trend going viral. It's overwhelming.
I hear you. It's tough. But I think a big part of it is just being aware. The podcast really stressed how important it is to educate ourselves and other people about the potential dangers of these trends. The more we know about pica, like the actual disorder, but also the cultural and psychological stuff that plays into it, the better choices we can make for ourselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. So instead of just being like, ew, that's gross, we need to actually try to understand it a bit more.
Exactly. The podcast made it clear that pica is really complex with lots of different causes and effects. It's about recognizing that there are usually reasons why people do these things and that it's okay to ask for help if you or someone you know is struggling.
That's such an important message, especially with all the negativity and judgment you see online. This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening, hasn't it? It's way more than just about eating dirt. It's about understanding ourselves, our bodies, our minds, and how we deal with everything around us, online and offline.
I couldn't agree more. It's about looking at these trends critically and being aware of our own, weaknesses and remembering that what you see online isn't always the whole story.
It's like our brains just latch on to the weird stuff, even if it's not good for us. But you know what? The podcast did give me some hope. They said that pica, it is treatable, which is a huge relief, really.
Definitely. They were really big on early intervention, like maybe doing some blood tests to see if there's a deficiency, like we were talking about with iron or zinc. And if it's tied to mental health, they said therapy can help, like cognitive behavioral therapy.
Cognitive behavioral therapy. That's CBT, right? I've heard of it, but What does that even look like for someone dealing with pica?
Exactly, CBT. So basically, it's about helping someone figure out what thoughts and behaviors are, like feeding into their challenges and then changing them. So with Pica, CBT could help someone understand what makes them crave those non-food things and then give them healthier ways to handle those cravings.
So it's kind of like retraining your brain to break those patterns.
Yeah.
Sounds intense, especially
Wow.
for something that feels so, like, ingrained.
It's powerful stuff. And the thing that really stuck with me, the podcast kept saying how important it is to reach out for help if you're dealing with pica or if you know someone who is. It's not something to be ashamed of at all, and there are people who can totally help.
It's a really powerful message, especially with all the negativity and judgment you see online. Man, this deep dive has been wild, hasn't it? So much more to it than meets the eye. It makes you think about, like, our bodies, our minds, how we fit in with everything, online and off. It's a lot.
Totally agree. We can't just take these trends at face value. We got to be critical, aware of our own, let's say, quirks, and remember there's always more to the story than what you see online.
Absolutely. Wise words to live by, especially these days.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Pica, TikTok trends, and all the weirdness in between. Until next time, stay curious out there, but stay informed.